Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Laura Ciceri, and today I want to talk about COVID-19 recovery and how we build better supply chains. We're at a very early part of this pandemic, and what is different in this building of a supply chain response against a disruption is that there will not be a new normal with the pandemic. Instead, what we will have is disruption after disruption after disruption until there's a vaccination. And I'm not talking about just the announcement of a vaccination or the approval of a vaccination. I'm talking about widespread shots in the arm for the population. And that's going to take a long time. How long will that take? 12, 18 months, 3 years? I don't know. One of the things about this virus is we're learning that the virus drives the timetables. We don't. But here I want to share some thoughts to help you and your team. So who am I? My name is Laura Ciceri, and I'm a social scientist. I'm not a consultant. Consultants know the answers, and I'm a researcher. I'm trying to figure out the questions to ask, and along the way to do research on what we're doing. I write for the Supply Chain Leader. I write on Forbes, on LinkedIn, on my blog, The Supply Chain Shaman, for the Supply Chain Business Leader, which is different than other research analysts that write primarily for information technologists. I do follow trends in technology, and I do quantitative research, sit on 15 years of qualitative data, and I constantly am mining the data to drive insights, to try to help business leaders to drive better supply chains. Just a little bit about me, just to give you some reference. I think every time you hear from someone, it's good to know their background because everyone carries bias. And my bias is I was a business leader for over a decade and a half, running manufacturing plants as a chemical engineer, primarily in the food and household products areas. Then I built software, and I feel very fortunate to have had the experience of both running factories and building software. And then I have spent almost 2 decades as a research analyst helping people to sort out how they should select technologies. And my specialization is in planning, decision support, and new forms of analytics. So let's get started. As we think about the pandemic and the pandemic response and the fact that there's not a new normal, what's going to happen is very regionally, very local, there will be a phenomena called the hammer and the dance. And basically what will happen is people will scurry from their homes, they'll go to the beaches, they'll go to nightclubs, they'll go to conferences, they'll go to church. Anytime that people are around and droplets can form, over time we'll let our guard down and the dance will continue, and then suddenly we'll have a spike. And the spike will cause the hammer to fall, and we'll go through the cycle over and over and over again by region. And we know from the data, it's not a bell curve, that the infection rate happens really quickly and the recovery happens slowly. So as a result, supply chains need to adapt from inside out to outside in to sense markets locally and drive a local response, and to focus on minimization of lead time and drive a responsive and agile supply chain to be able to cope with the changes of the hammer and the dance. Now, traditionally, supply chains have focused on a broad brush approach. All regions are treated the same. All regions in the US, all regions in Canada, all regions in Mexico. But Vancouver will be very different than Ontario, and San Francisco will be very different than Phoenix. And the supply chain response, as we build it outside in, will focus on the hammer and the dance by locale. And the shifts, because we're not only dealing with a pandemic, but we're dealing with an economic downturn, is we will see a wave that will look very abnormal. We'll see pantry loading. because as the hammer starts to fall, people will pantry load, whether it's flour or yeast or guns or toilet paper, whatever people want to pantry load, they will. And then what will happen is the shelves will be empty. There'll be substitution. During this pandemic, I've tried brands I never thought I would try. Some I really like and I'll stay with, and some I won't. But this substitution effect, because shelves are empty, will happen. And then what will happen is we will start to have economics affected. We'll see stimulus checks, unemployment checks, and the market downturn. We have 20 to 25% of workers unemployed. That affects how people buy. It will become very local, the hammer and the dance, driven by a normal of economic stimulus. So a combination of economic downturn and a pandemic is something we have not seen before. So if somebody comes and says, I've got the answer, I'll tell you about the new normal, show them the street, because historic order patterns, historic supply chain practices provide little insight for what we need to do in this particular pandemic. So what to expect? Well, go to the drawing board and start mapping what this looks like for yourself. You'll see shifts in demand. When I was giving this presentation to a Canadian group, I had a paint supplier who said, yes, Laura, we're no longer selling gallons, we're selling quarts. And I also had a Scandinavian supply chain leader who says, yes, people are eating more potatoes and less rice. You just don't know what these shifts are going to be. But what we do know is that the shifts in demand are not going to be based upon historic order patterns. So what happens is that the traditional supply chain management practices of taking order patterns, pumping it into an advanced planning system, pushing out an output, are no longer going to help us in the pandemic. Instead, what we've got to do is we've got to be outside in. We've got to focus on consumption data. Now, what is consumption data? Well, it varies by industry. For high tech, if I'm selling cell phones, it might be activation data. If I'm in consumer products, it might be shelf withdrawal. And looking at a no-scan perpetual inventory signal to say, maybe I didn't have product in that store for that period of time. If I'm in the chemical industry, it might be RFID tags on tankers moving in and out, or it might be production schedules of my upstream manufacturers ordering my products. The shifts in demand need to be driven by consumption of the product. And we need to forecast based upon consumption trends, not based upon historic order trends. And when we do that, we need to hold ourselves accountable to forecast value add. How much better is this forecast than if I just took the shipments the past 30 days and focus on more regional patterns? Costs will be higher, whether you're moving stuff in logistics or buying raw materials. We know that we will see a skyrocketing of cost with everything except oil. The oil prices today are, unbelievably low. So everything that comes from oil derivatives will be lower in cost. We'll have manufacturing outages. One of the things that's clear, we've never designed the supply chain for social distancing. So manufacturing outages, manufacturing plant as it's traditionally designed, because it was never designed for social distancing, have workers in pretty close quarters, cafeterias. And what's going to happen is people get sick, we'll have hot spots, those particular factories will go down. And then we'll have supply disruption because of either bankruptcy, economic downturns, spikes, and logistics outages, because logistics outages will come from three reasons. One, of course, our truck drivers will, go through waves of catching the pandemic. A truck stop is anything but what I think about as a, COVID-friendly environment. So workers will get sick and carriers, but two, one of the issues is as we bring in goods, perhaps they've been on the water for a couple of months, we'll find that those are no longer the goods that we need, and so we'll need a place to put them. And initially, we may think we'll use containers. Well, we don't have an endless supply of containers. So we'll fill up containers and we'll fill up warehouses, and this will constrain the logistics environment. And so there'll be logistics outages for containers and maybe vans. And so, that will be number two. But third, with this economic downturn, expect that, we're going to have some bankruptcies. So, the good news is that with oil prices, it's easier for truckers, but our payables and our systems are not really friendly for truckers and high asset utilization. So expect that we are going to see some bankruptcy and some downturn in logistics. So logistics shortages, and if we get into quarantine across borders of 14 days, that's going to tie up our equipment even more. So expect the unexpected. So as we work through this, we're going to find that we need to navigate the shades of gray more than we ever have. And when you look at this chart, there are a lot of shades of gray. And when you think about data, data needs context. If I gave you a number for sales last month, you need context. Were we in stock? What was the market share? What was the basket? What was the ratio of the portfolio? We need data and context. And traditionally, we have focused on transactional systems, which are very black and white, very definite. But in this world of uncertainty, we are going to need what-if analysis. We're going to need sensing mechanisms. Pattern recognition is the world of new data science techniques and open source analytics. It's also a time where we can invest in the design of new processes, where we are able to deal with uncertainty. One of the things that's amazed me is in our current processes, we try to get really precise on imprecise data, right? If you look at the demand processes, instead of looking at what-if analysis and buffers and dealing with uncertainty, we try to get really certain on uncertain data. And so we should just stop the craziness and look at what-if analysis, buffers, sensing, and define new processes that allow us to utilize these new techniques. So for example, collaborative sales forecasting makes absolutely no sense in this time. The salespeople don't know any more than you do. The market is going to drive the response. Transportation RFPs make no sense in this time. Why? Because logistics cost and logistics availability is just too uncertain. And so sensing the market, translating the market, what-if analysis, simulations, modeling is really going to be key for people to make it through the downturn. So how to survive? Let's focus outside in. Let's look at consumption data. Get good at S&OP execution. Only 1 in 2 companies are able to drive an S&OP plan into execution. Expect supply chain disruption, so design for it. Make sure that you form a database of planning master data, things like lead time cycles. They're going to be very variable. Most people have implemented supply chain planning with a fixed lead time based upon when they implemented the system. Nah, that's not going to work here. What we need to do is record the lead times and look at variability of lead time. Getting a pig or a container through the Chicago rail yard in the winter is much different than the summer. Well, we need to account for that. And then look at how we align teams against shared metrics. Metrics like purchase price variance, OEE, really drive teams apart. Instead, what we've got to do is look at total cost. Only 29% of companies can really derive total cost easily. We need to look at first pass yield and schedule adherence in manufacturing, and shipments on time and in full for customer service, and focus on how we can drive change. So I like to say that we need to learn from the past, be really grounded in what the past practices are, then unlearn them, right? Things like one number forecasting, crazy and stupid in this environment. Things like collaborative forecasting, crazy and stupid in this environment. Things like transportation RFPs, absolutely not in this environment. Operational OEE focus, yeah, right, send your business over the cliff. We need to be able to turn our back on the historic practices to unlearn and build better, because we shouldn't just build the supply chain as we know it today. So to do that, let's look back. Now, the 2007 recession, which I lived through, had the establishment of a new normal. What we saw was we went through the downturn of the recession. It took about 3 months for leaders to adjust, and then we had followers, which took about 6 months, and then laggards took about 15 months, but we adjusted to a new normal. Not the case here. We're not going to have a new normal, but look at how long it took us to sense and align. Now, supply chains today are in worse shape than they were in 2007 because we have gotten less disciplined about planning. So I think that people are searching for a new normal. It's not going to happen. They're trying to adjust the supply chain and they're struggling. Now, before the pandemic happened, people wanted a more agile supply chain. And I define as agile supply chain as one that has the same cost, quality, and customer service given the level of demand and supply volatility. So as we think about the translation of the pandemic into the new response, we've got to think about how do we build the agile supply chain. And the agile supply chain requires design, and luckily we had higher inventory levels at the start of the pandemic. Then we had the Great Recession in 2017. Part of this was product proliferation and the long tail. An opportunity in this downturn and pandemic is to rationalize the product portfolio and get better at inventory management. So my reflection, I've written for almost 15 years on demand-driven. Market-driven is very different than marketing-driven, than sales-driven. A lot of companies believe that the marketing team should forecast or the sales team should forecast. A functional view of forecasting is very different. The only thing that the marketing forecast, sales forecast, financial forecast, and supply chain forecast have in common is the word forecast. Break the habit, look at market-driven based upon consumption, design demand-driven processes with zero latency, and build buffers. The other thing we've talked about is building value networks. The supply chain is linear, it's inside out, and it doesn't connect well to the outside world. Portals are a dead-end street, and most people don't know how to connect the supply chain and drive interoperability. So don't make the mistake of believing that the efficient supply chain is the foundation for either demand-driven or value networks. The efficient supply chain based upon ERP and conventional advanced planning concepts focus on functional silos and efficiency within the four walls. I'm talking about building better, building outside in, translating across value networks. And as we do that, we find that much of what we've invested in for the efficient supply chain is no longer a value. So an effective supply chain is fit for purpose. it has a clear goal. It's efficient, it's responsive, it's agile. It focuses on outcome. It looks at how are companies doing on performance or the ability to have balance sheet comparisons. Are you driving improvement against peer group? Are you resilient year over year? So this outcome-driven goal definition is important to design fit for function. And as we think about building better, we've got to think about the fact that what we have to unlearn is functional, linear, transactional, inside-out thinking. Instead, what we've got to think about is how do we work cross-functionally? How do we model non-linearity? How do we focus on sensing, learning, and acting, and building outside-in processes? So it's an exciting world as we think about, going from inside out to outside in, or focus on, building a value networks and the use of new forms of analytics and embracing open source. The goal is not integration. The goal is synchronization and interoperability. There's a need for sensing and reducing of cycles and building the outside in processes. That's why we should think about digital twin, what if modeling, and getting really good at open source analytics and sensing. Now, if we look at risk management, the World Economic Forum, the Global Risk Perception Study, has shown progressive risk focus on the geopolitical to environmental issues. People thought a pandemic was not very likely. If you look at all of the outcomes that they conceived, the pandemic was rated extremely low. And this was the risk map of over 600 business leaders in the May time period. And our research has shown that operations complexity and the risk of managing operations complexity has been accelerating as we've built global supply chains. And bringing that in because we had the lack of the pandemic preparedness, we had built complex global supply chains that depended on borders that were transparent without friction and the availability of logistics. The risk drivers continued with supplier viability and economic uncertainty. And our mental model is that we go through a disruption and then we hit a new normal. So if you look at our past risk issues, they're not good models either, because this is going to be disruption after disruption, a hammer and a dance. And, we don't have a good mental model from what has happened before. So how do we build better? Well, we have to, first of all, fill the black holes of visibility, work on putting the customer first, tracking our shipments to the customer, connecting and designing processes for shipments, and focus on cross-functional process thinking. And inbound transportation is our biggest Achilles heel when it comes to logistics. And then as we look at the visibility of status within the organization, this is also an issue. And we need to rethink planning, align engines with outcomes, redeploy demand planning, use consumption data, build a planning master database, apply machine learning to improve sensing, focus equally on S&OP planning and execution, and stop things like collaborative sales forecasting, deployment of traditional APS and ERP. And if you've got an ERP project in motion, I would say, do you need to stop it? And also stopping transportation RFPs. So what to do until there's a vaccine? Focus. Build an operational team and a recovery team. Focus the operational team on managing the day-to-day and the recovery team on reimagining capabilities, design. Build strong supplier development teams and reimagine how you can build agility and reduce latency through analytics and design the supply chain continually. So in short, we must learn to unlearn, to relearn, and accept that there's not going to be a new normal. except that we're going to be living for a long time in the world of uncertainty. What got us here is not the answer in this pandemic, and innovation makes much of what we have legacy. So that gives us the opportunity to build better. I'm going to leave you with those thoughts, and hopefully we can continue the dialogue in our next session. Until next time, thank you.